Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our third annual Uno Higgins O'Malley Memorial Lecture, which this year, due to the restrictions of COVID-19, is being brought to you via the Zoom platform. My name is Barbara Walshe, and I've been chair of the board at Glencree for the last 6 years. Uno Higgins O'Malley was a co-founder of the Glencree Centre. She spent her life campaigning for peace and reconciliation as part of her own journey to reconcile with a violent past, where her father, who was the Minister for Justice in the first government after partition, was violently killed. Tonight, we welcome another woman who has dedicated her life to peace building and reconciliation, Jo Berry. You will shortly hear from Jo about how the tragic violent loss of her father, Sir Anthony Berry, at the hands of an IRA bomb, shaped her life and healing, and continues to shape her response to violent conflict and harm across the world today. Jo's story, like Una's, shows us what can be achieved through personal healing. Tonight, we want to look deeper at the possibility of reconciliation and whether healing divisions at personal or political level can contribute to a more compassionate and empathetic politics at a societal level. Joining Jo on our panel this evening are Senator Emer Currie, community worker and peace advocate Helen Henderson, who has recently been appointed to the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, Muslim activist Fardus Sultan, and victim and survivor advocate Alan McBride. Moderated by journalist and writer Jo Little, we look forward to an engaging conversation as we examine different questions. What do we mean by reconciliation? How can healing and relationship building contribute to reconciliation at a personal and at a political level? Or can it happen at all? How does gender impact on different experiences of peace building? And what can we do to strengthen reconciliation and peace building over the next 5 years on the island of Ireland and between Ireland and Great Britain? Earlier, Jo Little spoke to Jo Berry about her journey of reconciliation. This segment was recorded to avoid any technical issues and will be followed by a live panel discussion to which you're invited to submit your questions. I'll now hand you over to Jo Little in conversation with Jo Berry. Thank you.
Good evening. It's an honour for me to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Jo Berry. Jo joins us from her home in Somerset. Jo's work as a peace builder has brought her to many, many venues throughout these islands and much further afield. On 300 occasions, she has shared a platform with Patrick Magee, the former IRA man, who was convicted of the murder of her father, Sir Anthony Berry, and 4 others in the Brighton bomb 36 years ago. Jo, may I begin by taking you back to that morning of the 12th of October 1984, when you, a woman in your late 20s, part of a largish family, first heard that an IRA bomb had been detonated in the Grand Hotel where your father and stepmother were staying, along with many other luminaries from the Tory party, as they held their annual conference there. Your father was the deputy whip of the party in Westminster. Can you tell us, can you recall the first news reaching you of that bomb and what your feelings were?
I can. I mean, that day will never go away. I woke up to my twin sister shouting very loudly, "A bomb's gone off in Brighton at the Grand Hotel. Is that the hotel Dad and Sarah are staying at?" And it was about 5:30 in the morning. She got up early because she was a teacher. And I remember moving from a deep sleep to utter shock because I knew they had been staying at the Grand Hotel. And then there were hours and hours of waiting, trying to get information. We were in London. My brother was working in Brighton, so we rang him up. And we were trying to find out whether they were okay. My brother went to the hotel and he could see that part of the front of the hotel had been blown up. And he knew that was the room they'd been staying at because he'd been with them the night before. And he found my stepmother in hospital about 3 PM, and then he rang back later to say that they found my dad's body.
And of course, a ring he was wearing was key to the identification of your late father.
Yes, my brother had the same signet ring, so they used the ring to identify his body. And then we had the painful task of going to pick up my half-brother and half-sister, who were both teenagers, and take them to stay with our aunt in London. And I remember telling them that their dad was dead, and that's the kind of thing that I wouldn't want anyone to have to do, these innocent, beautiful teenagers, knowing their lives were going to be changed forever. And I was aware of the IRA. I mean, living in London, we did have bombs go off. We had bomb scares as a teenager. I couldn't always get to school. But I never thought my father would be a target, and it was complete shock. And I couldn't go back to the person I had been before the bomb, because now I feel I'm part of a war, I'm part of a violent conflict, I have an enemy. And so I decided 2 days later, if I can bring something positive out of this, if I can bring meaning, if I can even understand why people would kill my father, then I'm going to be okay. I have to create something positive out of this. And so a journey started.
Was that because you could see what the alternative would be if you only took negative out of it?
Yes, I mean, you're right. I think I saw it as a choice. Do I stay a victim, blame and become bitter and almost give up on the values I already had? I was already thinking about what nonviolence meant. I'd been thinking about how can we not have wars? That was really important to me. And do I give up on the person I had been? Or do I find a way to transform that pain and not blame someone else? And I saw it as a choice. But of course, it was a choice that I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to understand the IRA. I didn't know how to bring something positive out of it. At 27, I didn't have a huge amount of emotional intelligence. It was a whole new world for me.
You made that decision in a very contemplative environment. Can you tell us a little bit about that? You were reflecting very deeply.
There was a church in London called St James's Church, and I went there on the Sunday, and the bomb went off on the Friday. And I just sat in the pews and made that decision. And at the time, there was a group called Generals for Peace, and they were giving a talk. And no one knew I'd made this pledge. Like, it wasn't something that I could even talk to people about. But I knew that I'd made that decision and that a journey had started, and it gave me a sense of purpose. It didn't help me to deal with the trauma and the pain or the shock, but it gave me a sense of where I wanted to go.
And of course, that took the form of you literally going, in the first instance, to Northern Ireland in 1985, 86, around the time the Anglo-Irish Agreement was being signed, and then onwards into other parts of Ireland. Can you tell me about that decision to go to Northern Ireland?
I wanted to go there to meet people who could share with me their stories. And I started off going to a workshop by an amazing woman called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she was doing a workshop on grieving. And I went there were many people there from the north of Ireland as well as the Republic. And it was in Armagh at Benburb, and a monastery. And I, after that, didn't go home and went and stayed in many people's houses, and even did a talk at a peace centre. And I met people who shared with me what it was like to live there. I'm not someone who learns from reading books, or I'm someone who learns by emotionally engaging with people. So it was a very important time. And I went to Glencree in '86. Someone took me there and showed me a children's art exhibition. Children from Belfast, from both sides, doing their art of what it was like to live there. And that, I remember, that had a huge impression on me.
So it made you have a vivid memory of that, clearly. What were your emotions seeing children, some of them maybe not much younger than your own siblings, dealing with these issues?
Well, my heart just went out to them. You know, I think for me, the bomb opened my heart to the realities of suffering and of war. And one of the reasons I want to bring something positive out of it, because I thought I can't change the past, but if I can somehow change the future. And I was acutely aware of the pain that children would be going through. Of course, I wouldn't know because I wasn't them, but I was feeling for them. And after 86, I didn't go anymore to Northern Ireland, but I remember every time a bomb went off, I felt it and I cared. And I wanted it all to stop. Obviously, everyone wanted to stop, but I wanted somehow to help as well. And I called that sort of the kind of quite the dark years, because I couldn't do anything. And the people around me didn't even know that my dad had been killed. I never talked about it. I didn't tell my daughters. It was something that was too difficult. And it was only when we had the peace process and the Good Friday Peace Agreement that my life changed in a big way again.
Tell us about that. I mean, what were your feelings as the peace process nudged forward, took steps backwards through the late 80s and 90s to find itself in the form of the Good Friday Agreement, as it's called here?
Yeah, well, I wanted the agreement. I remember the emotions around the time and the stresses of was it going to happen, and eventually it did. And for me, that was an opportunity for the healing to start happening. And I remember one day turning on the TV, and there was only one person who was ever sentenced for planting the bomb at the Grand Hotel, Patrick Magee. And I remember seeing the headline of the news, Patrick Magee coming out of prison. And I remember looking at him and thinking, it's okay for you, you've got your life back. My dad can never come back. And feeling quite angry, but then thinking, this is for peace. This means less people are going to be killed. So I did welcome it. And soon after that, I got invited to my first victims support weekend at Glencree. And I finally met other people who'd been through what I'd been through, because in England, everyone's very separated who'd been affected by IRA bombs. So there's never been any kind of support group. And I'd never ever been offered any support since '84. So finally in 2000, I was meeting other people who'd been through what I'd been through, who didn't say to me, surely you've let go of it by now. They understood how huge these things are and the ripples of the trauma. And we created amazing new relationships of people from different backgrounds, because the pain that we shared was the same pain, whoever it was who hurt our loved ones. And that was a very transformative time.
You then found your voice, as you put it. You say you began to trust yourself again. And that set you on a certain trajectory about your relationship with Patrick Magee.
Well, during the year 2000, I decided that I wanted to meet him. I knew he'd left the IRA. I knew I was safe to meet him. And I wanted to see him as a human being. I wanted to meet him to hear his story, not to change him, but to change myself. If I could see him beyond the faceless enemy and the labels he was given, then that was going to help my humanity, something I'd lost in the bomb. And it was almost 20 years ago, in November, a friend of mine, amazing peace builder woman, Anne Galler, her real friend, who I'd known since '85, she arranged for Patrick Magee to come to her house. And I remember being terrified going there. I was coming from North Wales, but it sort of helped me that no one knew I was doing this. So I was doing it as a very personal, one-off experience that no one would ever have to know. And so I wasn't having to think what my family how they would view this. It was purely for me. But I was still terrified. And I remember when he walked into the room, this is just a normal kitchen in a suburb in Dublin. And my first thought was, a ridiculous thought was, he doesn't look like a terrorist. But whatever, that wasn't, what is our idea of a terrorist? You know, he was a man who spoke very quietly, who seemed quite nervous meeting me. And we went into our own room. And that first meeting was 3 hours. And I still remember it was very incredibly intense. And he did start off by giving me a lot of the political causes and the political reasons why the IRA had started. And I did know that. I'd done my own research. I'd met other men who'd been in the IRA, and I knew who was going to come with that. They were the ones who were oppressed, and they had no other choice. He saw suffering in his community. And so I was curious, and I listened a lot to him. and I asked lots of questions. And I remember looking into his eyes at one point and realizing that he's no longer a faceless enemy, that I've seen that he deeply cared for his community. That was his motivation. And so he was no longer just this enemy, but he was justifying killing my father, and that was difficult to hear. So after about an hour and a half, I thought, I'm going to end this now. I've got what I want. No one need ever know. I'm just going to go. And that's when he stopped talking and he looked at me and he said, I don't know anymore who I am. Can I hear your anger and your pain, and what can I do for you? And in that moment, I knew that he'd taken off his political hat and he'd opened up and become much more vulnerable. And it was the start of his journey. You know, he arrived at that meeting thinking that it was all about my needs, but now he realized that he'd beginning to realize he'd lost some of his humanity through joining the IRA. And the conversation was very different after that. We were both much more vulnerable and emotional. And Patrick was asking lots of questions about my dad, trying to understand who he was. And when he arrived at that meeting, he just saw them as that horrible name, legitimate targets. You know, they were just in uniform. But now I can tell he's beginning to see my dad as a real human being, and that's profoundly emotional for him. And after about another hour, it's like 3 hours in all, I couldn't listen anymore. I'd reached my limit of being there. There were parts of me which were finding the whole thing quite difficult, and I needed to go. And so I thanked him, so I was going to go. And he said then, I'm really sorry I killed your dad. Now, I didn't go for an apology, because to me an apology doesn't bring anything back. But what I got from that was that he's now seeing my dad as a human being. And that meant something to me.
Despite the fact that your dad was a member of the royal household, would have been described, I think he was described in a subsequent television documentary, as the epitome of the British establishment. Patrick Magee could see beyond that.
That was the beginning of him seeing that. Now I remember, this is going back a year, I'm going forward a year, but I remember the first time we spoke in public in London, and he said, this is after a year of us speaking together, he said, I now know I could have sat down and had a cup of tea with Joe's dad. Now, the British government didn't have a policy of cups of tea. It's still not something that's there right in the heart of their politics. But for me, to imagine the two of them sitting together, it's an important metaphor. And it also shows me the importance of having those cups of tea before violence comes onto the agenda, because the cost of not having those cups of tea is too great, not just for me, but for, you know, many, many thousands and thousands of people.
You said that the meeting that you had in that suburban house in Dublin was to be the sole meeting between yourself and Patrick Magee, but it wasn't. You went on not only to have a succession of meetings with him, but to agree to them being recorded by a BBC documentary team.
It felt unfinished after that first meeting, like we started something in the second half of the meeting, and I needed to go back for another one. And so 2 or 3 weeks later, I'm there again, and this time Anne has asked a friend of hers, Michael Appleton, to come and to film it. And we'd both agreed, me and Patrick, it was purely for a reconciliation project. This was never going to go public. And Michael Appleton arrived and realized this was something very amazing and profound. And he then put a proposal to have us filmed several times. And that was a very difficult decision, but we always had a way of saying, well, actually, we could stop at any time. So that whole year we filmed in different places, but at any time either of us could have said that's enough. And I think even a few weeks before the filming, there were still hiccups. It was difficult for both of us for different reasons to go public.
Were there times during that series of recordings when you had to say things to each other which couldn't be put on the record, as it were? In other words, you would have to decide, look, I'm going to say something to him when the camera's switched off and when we have more privacy.
Yeah, it's a good question. We had a lot of time on our own without the camera, and that was important. So I think there were conversations that we had then, but maybe they could have been filmed. I don't know. I wasn't really thinking like that at the time. I was just, emotionally engaging with this very difficult subject. And as you said earlier, it was helping me trust myself, and I was getting my voice back. So there are times when I did challenge him, and I'm not sure how much of that was put in the final hour documentary, because the documentary was 55 minutes and there were hours and hours of us communicating.
Why is empathy more powerful in your view than forgiveness in a situation like this? Or in your situation, not in a situation like this, in your precise situation?
Well, I know people who have forgiven. I know people who say they can't forgive. And they're all amazing people. They're all doing incredible work in the world. These are people who themselves lost loved ones. I think forgiveness is a very personal thing. If forgiveness can be seen as not responding with revenge and putting revenge in the past and creating something positive, then yes, I do believe in forgiveness. I think quite often it also can be religious, and I know people who have given up their religion because they feel they should be forgiving and they can't because they're feeling anger. So forgiveness can put pressure on people to forgive before they felt the anger. I prefer to use the word empathy for me, because empathy to me leads to action, and to me empathy actually can heal the rifts and divisions that we have between us. And I remember at one point actually walking the Wicklow Mountains with Patrick and hearing so much about his past experience, reaching a point of realizing, if I'd lived his life, would I have made the same choices? And in that moment, there isn't anything to forgive. There's just that understanding and empathy. And I've had that with people from all sides in Northern Ireland. And I take that knowing that I can listen to everyone's story wherever I go around the world. And it's a way of not taking sides. It's very easy to think that one side's more right than another side, but actually, if we lived in each other's paths, we might have made the same choices. We might not have, we don't know.
I suppose the fly in the ointment is that you must continue to have empathy with the people you've loved since childhood, and many others who are part of your family's network, for instance. And they may regard what you have done as betrayal.
And that's fine. I'm not doing this to say I'm right and people are wrong at all. And if someone finds what I've done challenging or difficult, or they think I betrayed my dad, then I'll listen to them and want to understand their thinking. So for me, this is beyond trying to convince anyone that what I've done is the only way. I have total respect for someone who feels I betrayed my dad. I have looked into what betrayal means for me very, very deeply. And I've come to the conclusion the only real betrayal is when I betray my heart. And my heart is about seeing the humanity in everyone. But not everybody feels like that. And that's absolutely fine. It's so easy to move into being outraged by people and thinking that I'm right and you're wrong. But this is about really listening and knowing we're all in different stages of our journey, and we're all doing our best. And to me, it's crucial. And we're all responding to difficulties in our own way. So how can we listen and support each other is much more important.
Can you tell us about the wider work which all of this prompted? You founded a charity called Building Bridges for Peace. Can you bring us through the steps that brought you from dialogue with Patrick McGee to the actual foundation of this charity and deciding what its priorities were and what Patrick McGee's role might be in it?
Yes, so the charity Building Bridges for Peace is there because I began to see that the work that I wanted to do was growing and growing, and I needed the right kind of constitution to carry it. And so I got advice and went for a charity. It was a long time to get charitable status. And the vision is peace in the world through non-violent ways and to understand the roots of violence. And it's very much my charity, though Patrick has worked with me in the charity. And I've worked around the world. I've actually spoken with Patrick over 300 times in different places. And even when I'm not with him, I will talk about our story and what I've been learning. What I love most is when I stop speaking and a new conversation starts, and I create a safe place for people to open up their experiences of trauma, of conflict, of what it's like to live wherever they are, whether it's conflict countries, whether it's in London, whether it's in Belfast, because I think it's so important for people to be heard. And then also I can move into being a facilitator, and I'm trained in all sorts of conflict transformation and restorative processes, restorative justice. So I mean, my passion is creating a world where no one is demonized, and we have ways to have those different conversations without making someone wrong and us right.
Can you explain, for instance, how that has played out in the context of Israel and Palestine? You've been there, and that is often regarded as a place which has very, very strong parallels with our own situation in Ireland and Britain.
Yes, well, I only went there once, and that was with Patrick. We'd already met many people from Palestine and Israel, from the Parents Circle, which are bereaved family members, from Combatants for Peace, an extraordinary group of men and women from Palestine and Israel. And they invited us to come and speak. And so I got some funding. We went there for 10 days. And I remember the first time we spoke was to a group from Combatants for Peace, and it was in Jerusalem, and it was quite hard for the Palestinians to even get there. And they'd had to go through police checks, and they arrived late. They were all a little bit kind of agitated, and there was a real sort of tension in the air. And I remember thinking, what are we doing here? I live in peacetime. How can we possibly be of any assistance to the hugeness of what's happening here? So then we gave a talk, me and Patrick, and then we opened up for questions. And I remember someone said, so you come here, and what's your solutions for us? And we both said, we don't have any solutions. You have your solutions. We're here to share what's happening with us. And one of them said at the end, we've had a different conversation today. And I am now seeing our conflict mirrored back in a different way because of what you shared. And because it was a different trigger, they had different issues, different conflict. It was almost like it was a mirror on what they were going through, and enabled them to say things they hadn't said. And this is quite often what I find is people, they take what they need from the story. They can all identify with it because everyone's been hurt, and everybody's actually hurt as well. And everybody's trying to heal from trauma and heal conflict. And so people take what they need to take and make it their own story. I don't want to be there to give people answers. I think I thought about how do people change? And if I'd gone into that first meeting with Patrick and said, you've got to change, you need to do this and this and this, he would have stayed in a very safe place of righteousness. And I think people change because they choose to change, not because we tell them to change, but we can create the conditions that people are most likely to change. And so I call this way more like being restorative rather than punitive or controlling. And it's really important for me that I can create the safe space, and then people can choose to change. I find that quite often, I've done a lot of work in schools, and that's some of my most meaningful work. And quite often, after my talk, there'll be maybe one of the young lads will say, I think you should have killed Patrick McGee, revenge is the best. And one of the teachers will want to go, I'm so sorry, no, you shouldn't say that. And I always go, it's really important that he says that, and I'm going to acknowledge it. And I say to him, for you, the right thing would have been to have gone for revenge in that instant. How would it have been for you after you'd gone for revenge? How would you feel then? And then he would say, well, I would feel like I'd done the right thing. And then I go, okay, then how do you feel? I take him on a little journey. And then maybe at the end, he might even say, okay, now I'm thinking about it. Maybe next time I want to go for revenge, I'm going to take a deep breath. But if I said to him, "Oh, you're wrong that's wrong to go for revenge. It never works," he wouldn't have. He would have just, had a little laugh about me with his friends and carried on. So it's about respecting where people are and really validating their position.
Is restorative justice something that can fruitfully be used in our criminal justice systems?
Definitely, and you've got some amazing work in Ireland and in the north. And I do work as a restorative justice facilitator. My local police here it's in Wiltshire. I've just seen amazing things happen when people work restoratively, and when people hear the impact of what they've done, then they choose to change and gives the victim a voice. And what I did was a kind of restorative process, but without all the safety. There was no facilitator, there was no preparation, there was no support afterwards. When I'm a facilitator, we do huge amount of preparation and support to enable that conversation to happen in a way which isn't going to re-traumatize the victim, but is going to empower the victim to have a voice and be able to share the impact of the other's behavior on them.
And I understand that this field of work led you to work specifically with young women and girls in the East London housing project of Tower Hamlets. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing there?
The last 5 years, I've been working a lot in Tower Hamlets, and I go into some schools which can be 100% non-white. And I've also worked a lot in one school which is just girls, and I had a project called the Peace Ambassador Project. And so I would, depending on the school, depending on how much time they would give me, I would work with a small group and to enable them to have a way of creating a positive project. So they could choose what they wanted to do. But before that, I would take them through a process. And I remember sometimes some of the girls saying to me, it seemed to be the girls want to engage more with the boys, but not always. And I remember these girls, and they said to me that I was the first white person to listen to them and believe in them and take them seriously, like ever, which is really shocking that wasn't their normal experience. And I would just go in there and say, tell me, how are you impacted? Tell me what's happening to you. And I remember the first Monday morning, they were all half asleep, and within 10 minutes, they're all of them sitting up and excited and sharing and telling me what their daily lives are like, and the racism that they feel, how they're racially profiled, the stories, how they feel about their lives and their dreams. And I actually see it as a real privilege to be there to listen to them, to witness to them.
And you mentioned earlier that the girls seem more willing to participate in these kinds of discussions than the boys in the schools that you visit, and that therefore you found yourself facilitating perhaps a little bit more dynamically with girls. Is it easier for a woman peace builder to deal with younger people than a male?
There certainly is a role for women peace builders, and in the world, most peace processes, women are still being left out. There's not gender equality at all. And though a lot of women are doing the work to rebuild the community and bring the issues to the peace table, they're not the ones that are signing the agreement. They're not the ones at the table. And I think the voice of women is hugely important. I think the capacity to empathize, to understand the needs of the community, to be able to take action quickly is really, really important. I think for women, they can understand that it's not necessarily a quick fix. They're looking at solutions that's going to work for everyone. And there's amazing women around the world working in conflicts who aren't known, and they should be known.
What about the language and discourse of reconciliation? Do you find that this language of reconciliation is spoken more widely now than it was when you began building bridges for peace?
So I think we are much more aware. When I think back to myself 20 years ago, and I was really struggling in many ways, it was all very new to me. And now, anyone who wants to take part in any kind of restorative process or justice, there's lots of places to go. There's places where people can get supported. And of course, the work in Northern Ireland is exceptional, it's outstanding. The cross-community work, the amazing projects, and I don't know about them all, but the ones I do know are incredible, and they're a testimony to people's resilience and intelligence and capacity to let go in Northern Ireland. In fact, I think other countries, well, I know they do, can learn from some of the ways that people have been brought together. So I think looking back on the last 20 years, there's been so many success stories, and it's very easy to think about the challenges that are clearly we have now between these islands. Are massive challenges. But I think we've got something to build on, which is an incredible foundation of reconciliation, of listening, of cross-community work, of dealing with trauma, like the Wave Centre. And there's some fantastic work that's been happening, and also some work here in England as well. And I want to say that I wouldn't be where I am now without my amazing time at Glencree, and be able to spend time there with other people, listening, learning, and sometimes getting angry, crying, grieving. And I'm indebted to Glencree, and it's such an honour today to be speaking at this lecture.
I'm very grateful to you for joining us, Jo Berry.